Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome to my talk. We are always living in the final days, or why we should hope for the future. I'm going to have to be looking back because I don't have this all memorized. First of all, I want to apologize for my casual attire. I don't normally dress quite this casually for conferences. I looked in my suitcase and I just completely forgot anything proper and decent to wear. So this is real game dev attire, though. What I'm going to be going over in this talk, I have a lot of hopes for the broadening of post-apocalyptic games and what they represent and the things that we explore within post-apocalyptic games. This is not prescriptive. I'm not here telling people what sort of games they're supposed to make, so don't yell at me if a game developer sees this and thinks that I'm specifically targeting you. Maybe I am, but you shouldn't feel that way. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of post-apocalyptic games. I'm certain that there are many academics in this room that could do a much better job than I could, but I will briefly go over it just to show how broad it really is. I'm going to talk about a lot of common sort of themes and conflicts within post-apocalyptic games. Some of these are natural as part of the setting. Some of them I feel are kind of well-worn at this point, and I feel like maybe we should focus on other things. I want to talk about different trends I'd like to see because it's not enough in my mind to just complain about stuff I'm tired of seeing. I want to talk about things that I do want to see. I want to give examples of games that are already doing it because it's not like no one is exploring these new spaces. It just seems like it's not quite there yet, in my opinion. And specific things that I want to see more of. So a little bit about my background, which Natalie actually went over a little bit, but we'll go over it again. My name is Josh Sawyer. I am the studio design director at Obsidian Entertainment. We're located in Southern California. I played role-playing games growing up. I started with computer role-playing games and then transitioned over to tabletop, or it was a little bit mixed, but a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of things of that nature. In college, I played Fallout 1 and 2. Those came out right when I was in the middle of college. I thought they were fantastic games. They did a lot to influence how I thought about computer role-playing games, especially when it comes to choice and consequence and difficult decision-making, which are really at the heart of those games. I have a bachelor in arts and history after a lot of wandering. I actually started as a music student, but I graduated with a degree in history. And naturally, with a degree in history, I became a website designer for Black Isle Studios, where eventually I became a game designer on the Icewind Dale series. I stayed there until 2003, just before it shut down. I then went to Midway in San Diego for a couple of years until that got very close to shutting down. And then I left and I went to Obsidian. And Obsidian was made up of a lot of the former members of Black Isle Studios. And a lot of the people at the studio had worked on Fallout 1 and 2. We had wanted to work on another Fallout game, but we didn't get the chance at Black Isle. So while I was at Obsidian, I actually did get the chance to direct a Fallout game, which I was really thrilled about. And that was Fallout New Vegas. But other games that I've directed at Obsidian are Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, which are isometric fantasy role-playing games, not really post-apocalyptic at all, and the 2022 narrative adventure game Pentiment, set in 16th century Bavaria. So a variety of genres. To talk about the background of post-apocalyptic games, you can go back to the late 70s and early 80s. You can look at tabletop games like Gamma World and Twilight 2000. These are not the very first ones, but I think these are the ones that were really formative for a lot of people back in this time. Gamma World is sort of wild and wacky. Radiation mutates. You have sentient trees and huge talking rabbits with miniguns and things like that. So it's a little on the more imaginative and silly side. And then you have games like Twilight 2000, which are more about the sort of gritty reality of ex-military people going through a post-apocalyptic world. And those sort of set the tone for a lot of the stuff that came after. Games like Wasteland, Robotron 2048 is technically post-apocalyptic. It's robots taking over the world. But the first game I think a lot of people think of as really the foundation of what we think of post-apocalyptic computer games is Wasteland. Wasteland was made by Interplay. Interplay later became Black Isle. I'm ashamed to say that actually this was the one early Interplay RPG I did not play for some reason. Played all the Bard's Tales. I played Dragon Wars, which almost no one played, but for some reason I never got around to Wasteland. But of course I did play Fallout 1 and 2. Fallout 1 and 2 came out in the late 90s, also from Interplay, from Black Isle Studios, the role-playing game division that formed within it. And these games were really focused on not just the aesthetic of the post-apocalyptic world and the combat, but also a big focus of them was choice and consequence. What sort of person are you going to be in this world? And many quests were offered in such a way where you had many ways to approach them. Violence was always an option, but also talking and sneaking was always an option. So it really presented you with a world that you could play in as you saw fit and made the player ask themselves difficult questions about what sort of person they wanted to be, which I found fascinating at the time, and a lot of gamers did too. About 10 years later, there was a new wave of post-apocalyptic games, the Stalker games, which I think are really cool, extremely atmospheric. Also, the new era of Fallout games from Bethesda, games like Fallout 3 and 4. Of course, Fallout New Vegas, which we made with Bethesda's tech. These brought the games into a 3D environment. A lot of them still did focus on these morally gray sort of worlds that we have to trudge through and difficult decisions that we have to make within them. But then there were more that came later, the Metro series, 2033 and Exodus, the Walking Dead series from Telltale. Tokyo Jungle, I think, is a particularly interesting example because you're playing animals in the ruins of Tokyo. I particularly like that you can have a gang of Pomeranians running around, which is very cute. Of course, The Last of Us 1 and 2 arguably are as large in the public consciousness as Fallout, especially since there's now TV shows for both of them. But The Last of Us, a different type of apocalypse, representing a shift in the trend of the fears that we face culturally. State of Decay and its sequels, Horizon Zero Dawn and Forbidden West, which are post-apocalyptic games, which I'll get to. Dying Light 1 and 2, The Division 1 and 2, Frostpunk 1 and 2. These are all post-apocalyptic games. There are hundreds more, by the way. I can't even cover them all. A very, very popular genre of game. And it's important to understand that when we talk about post-apocalyptic games as a genre, it doesn't necessitate a type of gameplay. It's about a type of world and a space, and usually a sort of morally gray world that we live in. Very often choice and consequence and moral decision-making and ethical decision-making is at the heart of the gameplay, but not always. So there can be games that have no combat at all that are post-apocalyptic, and there can be games that are just bloodbaths that are post-apocalyptic. So it's more about a world and a setting rather than a type of gameplay, etc. So changing threats are very important to think about when we talk about post-apocalyptic games. The first games in the series, and some that are still the most popular, really focused on nuclear threats. I'm almost 49 in a few days, 49 years old, so I'm Gen X, and I lived through the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was very surreal to me because for my entire life, I understood that the world was kind of split in two. I mean, as a child, but that was the mentality, is that there was this world and that world, and we were in a Cold War, and that any moment nuclear war could erupt, which is a crazy thing to live under. Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky, who are two of the main people behind the Fallout series, really thought about that heavily, and that influenced how they shaped Fallout, which is all about post-nuclear life. A lot of games are about this idea that nuclear holocaust wipes over the world, almost all humans are destroyed, and then a few try to survive in the ruins of it. But these reflected the fears not only of the Cold War, but then after the Cold War, then the fear actually shifted in the public consciousness, which you can see reflected in a lot of media. Rogue nuclear weapons. Like, where'd they all go? They're all kind of floating around, and bad actors could get them and start World War III, even though the Cold War is over. So this persisted for quite a long time. And then it shifted over to something else, pandemic and zombie threats. I remember in the 90s when fear of disease became really present in the public consciousness, usually relating to Ebola. There were films like Outbreak. By the way, all these movies became very popular at the beginning of COVID. People looked back to sort of see how people dealt with this, even in a fictional context. But fears about pandemic, not only pandemics that killed us, but pandemics that would change us, transform us into zombies or monsters or things of that nature. So we started to see a rise of this sort of conflict within games, that this was the apocalypse that was facing us, and we would have to survive in these worlds. And then most recently, we have climate threats. This can be climate change, climate collapse, ecological disaster. It can take a number of different forms, from heat to cold, extreme cold. You have things like frostpunk, very wild and violent weather. It can take a number of different forms, but it all reflects a public sort of awareness and fear of this as apocalypse, that we're always sort of at any moment or one of these days, something really terrific will happen that will push us over the edge. However, despite all of this, there are similar themes that run throughout most of these games, not all of them. The first is that there is no law or there is no rule of law. So either there is no order, no law, no structure whatsoever. Everyone is a victim to the whims of any other human being in the world, or monsters or threats of some sort, or there is no rule of law, meaning there is law for a selective few under tyranny or some other sort of brutal regime. The only sorts of governments often in these worlds are ones that are run by dictatorships. Slavery is rampant, things of that nature. Very bleak. Resource scarcity. This can mean food and water, but it can also mean other resources, building resources, fuel, heat, things that are necessary for survival. Certainly, it's very rare that you see thriving within these societies. Resource scarcity is always sort of brought to the forefront and keeps everyone desperate. And because everyone is desperate, you have human depravity. This is extremely common. People descend into the worst things that human beings can become, not only because of the scarcity and the lack of rule of law, but there's this thematic idea that it brings out the worst in people. And so if someone is secretly a sadist, once the world ends, then their sadism is let loose on the world and they just become these awful monsters. I just want to bring up I think there's maybe too many cannibals in these worlds. This is just something to think about. It's kind of a diversion here, but it keeps coming up in my mind. I wanted to bring this up. Humans are really hard to hunt. There's the reason why the story of the most dangerous game is called that. It's because humans are nasty, tricky. We can use tools. Very, very dangerous. Very bad. No one in these worlds ever engages in animal husbandry. Nobody has chickens. Nobody plants a seed. No one thinks that maybe they could grow corn or something. By the way, there are settings that perfectly answer this perfectly well. The Road, and I hope most people know The Road. Great book by Cormac McCarthy turned into a film. Nothing grows. Nothing can grow. That's just part of the setting. So of course people are going to be eating other people. And then there is actually a German film called Hell that deals with the sun becoming so bright that basically nothing can grow on the surface of the earth. So those two, you got to pass. Otherwise, just think about it. I don't think there would be so many cannibals. We love miraculous doodads in post-apocalyptic fiction. Tech is the salvation of the world. I'm sure you're all used to hearing that today, but also this is a common theme within post-apocalyptic settings. The world is screwed up, but what if we had some technology? We could just fix it. So you have things like the Garden of Eden creation kit in Fallout. This is basically a little box that you can throw on the ground and then, woo, terraforming. We can just grow a new society. Why should human beings bother to learn how to plant the seed? No reason. Just get a geck and put it on the ground and you can just take off from there. Also things like cures for plagues. So The Last of Us is obviously hinges upon this plague. It has reduced the world to a lot of infighting factions. It's very bad. The solution to get through this is this cure to a plague. Never mind the fact that human beings lived through a different plague, the plague, and they didn't find a cure for it, and it sucked, but they got through it. But often cures for plagues are presented as, we live in this state of ruin, and the only thing out is a miraculous cure. Unlimited clean energy. Why curb our behavior or change anything about the way that we do things in the world if we could just have clean energy? Fossil fuels have problems. Nuclear waste is certainly no joke. But if we had clean fusion, everything would be fine. We just go back to the way that it was before. So we just get that, and we don't have to worry about all the knock-on effects from everything else that we do. And then we have something like Gaia from Horizon, which is basically, how about if we just reboot everything? What if we just had a technology that could reboot the whole world, reboot humans? We can just start over and we'll just do it better. So don't fix the problems that we face through human interactions or the things that we do. Just flip the switch and we'll do it better next time. The idea here is generally that human behavior is just a symptom of not enough technology. We're doing really badly right now because the circumstances are bad, but we don't have enough tech, which I understand. I think it's a little overly cynical. I don't think it's invalid to explore. I do think we explore it a little too much. Religion is bad. It's always bad. Games, I would say, don't handle religion particularly well overall. Post-apocalyptic settings, it's almost always extremely negative. Cults. So you never in a post-apocalyptic setting see just a kind of regular religion that people believe in and just mind their own business. It's never that. It's a cult. They're all very insular. They're fanatical. They're very opposed to people that are not part of their in-group. And often the religion is used to control people through obfuscation. Not always, but often religion hides or lies about things in the world knowingly, disinformation, to trick people to keep them within the religion. So this is a very common trope when religion is explored in post-apocalyptic settings, almost never positively. Also, all arts just stop. Like everyone stops doing art. Post-apocalyptic societies generally only look backwards. When we do make art, we mimic and kit bash things from the old world. Kit bashing is a very common aesthetic of post-apocalyptic settings to show that we are scrapping things together, but we can't move forward. We revert to earlier simplistic artistic stages. So when you do see art, it's usually represented as more primitive in style. And societies don't ever create new modes of expression. It's extremely rare for games to explore this space. There are some games, by the way, it's a subgenre of the post-apocalypse, which is the post-apocalypse. These are games that are set very far after the inciting apocalyptic incident, and the circumstances are not ongoing. So, for example, bombs drop, radiation persists, but like bombs are not continuously dropping. Or a plague spreads and it causes problems, but then it goes away. And so the world keeps moving. New societies form in these worlds, and it explores what do these new societies do. Canticle for Leibowitz is actually one of the earliest examples of post-apocalyptic fiction that not only explores the nuclear holocaust, but also post-apocalyptic societies. So in Canticle for Leibowitz, it is centuries after the atomic war. Most people can't read English anymore. When they encounter things from the old world, they have no idea what they're looking at. They're basically artifacts. And it's a very interesting exploration of how this culture, which does maintain certain things like Catholicism and Latin, but not English, moves on and tries to progress. And it spans several centuries. But also games like the Horizon series explore a world that is so far advanced that humans no longer remember the world that came before them, which I think is a very interesting place to explore. And even a game like Chance of Sonar, a more recent game where there has been some murky apocalypse in the past that has created this Tower of Babel where no one can communicate with each other and you're kind of piecing the mystery together. But the society persists long after the inciting incidents and no one can even remember them anymore. I explored the post-apocalyptic world within Fallout New Vegas, and I had a bunch of reasons for doing so. So the thing is, I always thought of Fallout New Vegas as a sequel to Fallout 2, which might sound kind of arrogant, but Fallout 3 is set on the East Coast of the United States. If you're not familiar with the geography of the United States, it's big. It's really big. It's one of those things like Americans have a difficult time understanding how close things are in Europe, and Europeans often, sorry to generalize, it's so big. So like the West Coast is very far from the East Coast. And the events in Fallout 3 didn't seem like they would have much impacts on the events of Fallout New Vegas. So a lot of what we did was explore where does the world of Fallout 2 go later. Fallout 2 already had republics in the form of the New California Republic. They had city-states, they had infrastructure, they had economies, trade networks, things like that. It was set way like, I can't remember exactly, I'm sure someone will tell me, but it's like 100+ years. It's way long time after the bombs have fallen. So I said, what if let's just keep going? We have 2 points. We have Fallout 1, we have Fallout 2. We see the advance in technology and social organization between them. What if we kept going? And what if we had competing ideologies and economies? So we have the New California Republic. They're representing sort of traditional democratic values. Caesar's Legion it's very much a fascist dictatorship, military dictatorship. And then you have Mr. House as this kind of weird libertarian overlord. We even, because we're talking about currency, we have our currency making machines. There are competing currencies in Fallout New Vegas. So instead of just saying, well, it's been bottle caps in Fallout 1 and 2 and 3, let's just keep using bottle caps. I said, well, why would they use bottle caps? And we explored that. So bottle caps are actually a backed currency. as currencies used to be. We now have fiat currency where central banks say, here is money, it's worth this much. And we sort of go, if you say so, and we use it. But in the old days, we had a gold standard. In Fallout, they had a water standard. So bottle caps stood for an amount of water at the water caravans. In the hub, you're in a desert. That's very important. But then there was fiat currency in the NCR, and there was specie currency, gold and silver from the Legion. So we explored the ideas of what these currencies meant within the world and what they meant to the cultures that they represented. But all of the cultures that we represented were very backward looking. A theme that emerged as we worked on the game is this idea of recreating a new world in the image of the old. The NCR is looking to the United States. Caesar's Legion is looking to the Roman Republic. Mr. House is looking to Rat Pack era Vegas. But you also have groups like the Kings who are emulating Elvis, the Great Khans who are emulating Mongols. There are all these groups that are basically looking backwards to move forwards. A lot of people don't like this very much, by the way. There are a lot of people that don't like the post-apocalypse. Some players and devs really want their apocalypse to be just a certain way. Society should not rebuild. Stability should not return. Technology should not advance. Aesthetics should not change. It's basically a frozen world. It's a world that's perpetually living in the ruins and the wake of the destruction that came before, unable to move forward. That's a way you can do that. It leads to something that I don't particularly like, which I think of as just apocalypse as aesthetic, being frozen in a state of being for the sake of maintaining an aesthetic or a feeling, which, again, not invalid, just not something I'm particularly interested in. Aesthetics are often mimicked without consideration. We will take something that we see in a previous game or a previous movie or a previous graphic novel, and we slap it into a world because it's comfortable feeling. By the way, this is not unique to post-apocalyptic games. It's very common in fantasy. Why is anything in fantasy the way that it is? Well, you could go back far enough and probably trace it back to probably Tolkien, maybe Michael Moorcock if you're feeling a little edgy, but that's about it. It's really rampant, but the longer a genre keeps going, it starts kind of regurgitating and copy and pasting and just tweaking things. And aesthetics are a comfortable shorthand. When you see someone wearing with a mohawk and wearing, metal and a tire, and they have a gun that's kind of like with a bit of masking tape around the handle, you're like, this is a post-apocalyptic game. It's an easy shorthand. There's a reason why people do it. But I feel like when that is not really considered fully, when those aesthetics and the way that people dress, the way that they use things, the way they live in the world is decoupled from material reality, we stop speculating. The power of speculative fiction is that we can speculate about the world. And if we're thinking about the future, we're speculating about how we would be and how we would live in these worlds. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with using post-apocalyptic aesthetics in a way that is mostly for just their aesthetic value, but I personally am more interested in exploring where we can go with it. So these are things that I would like to see. I want games to ask questions, generally speaking. I think it's especially if the player is an active participant in how the world is explored. I want games to speculate on the future. That's what interests me. When we have post-apocalyptic games, I want to ask, like, how would we live? How would we die? How would we move forward within these worlds? I believe that we possess the capacity to change. Historically, we have overcome a lot of stuff that's really awful. Much of it in our own doing, but we possess the capacity to rebuild. So I don't think that the end of an old world precludes the creation of a new world, or that world can change even beyond the first generation or however many generations come after it. And by the way, again, just so that no one takes this the wrong way, I don't think we all need to approach these and try to answer these questions, but I would like to see more games try to engage with this. And I do think that there is hope for the future within games dealing with post-apocalyptic themes. Games like Frostpunk 1 and 2, while extremely dire, are about trying to form a society. At their whole core, they're about exploring a society moving forward in the world. Horizon Zero Dawn and Forbidden West are very much about humans trying to live in a post-apocalyptic world. There is a small indie game called I Am Future, which is really about vibing on a rooftop. It's just about a guy like hanging out on his little rooftop thing. It's not so much focused necessarily on existential questions, but a chill vibe in the post-apocalypse. Death Stranding, I would say, is actually a sort of positive post-apocalyptic game. because Sam Porter Bridges is forming bridge. He is literally connecting people. That is the heart of the game. So in spite of the fact that it's a very weird game with a lot of interesting aesthetics, it is fundamentally, I think, about establishing human connections between people. And then Season, which tragically not that many people played, but Season is an interesting post and pre-apocalyptic game about a woman riding her bike through the world and writing a letter for future generations about the world that they left behind. Here's some stuff I'd like to see more of. Preservation of knowledge. I think that more of this would happen. I know that the internet is very important. I think we're seeing that it's also becoming kind of crappy over time, but it isn't everything. Like, there's a lot of stuff that is knowledge that is not on the internet. So even if the internet went down and we didn't have power to run our computers, there's still going to be knowledge in other forms. Every copy of the Bible would be really hard to destroy, Book of Eli. I know that's your central plot point. That would be really, really unbelievably hard to do. Possibly the hardest thing you could, like, if you gave someone an impossible task, that would be close to the top of the list. Books and magazines would still exist. I know there'd be floods and there'd be fires and my library, but like, there's so many books, there are so many magazines. And as long as literacy persisted, which I believe it would, then people would read them and they could figure out things to do and be smart. And vocations can be taught. So yes, I'm sure that in an apocalypse, mass catastrophe, lots of people dying, and we would lose a huge amount of practical knowledge, but people would live and persist, and they could teach other people how to do things, how to fix an engine or a sink or braze or weld or nail a board. Like, this is one of my funniest pet peeves from post-apocalyptic games is humanity lost the ability to nail a board straight next to another board. Like, it's always got to be like this with a big gap. That's all, and no one can saw anything anymore, right? It's all I find mismatched planks. I never saw them. I just slap them together as quickly as I can. So yeah, I think there would be a little more thought and care put into these things personally. I want to see humans show more ingenuity. We're very resourceful. We have a lot of knowledge of material science. So one of the things that I think is fascinating is, human beings for millennia really struggled to understand the material properties of different types of metals, how to refine things, steel, all these sorts of things that we now take for granted. And we can easily look up, like we can look up melting points. We can look up like relative brittleness of different types of metals. These are things that are now established that our ancestors struggled with. We don't gotta struggle with them. Like, so much of the problem of dealing with these things is just knowing what to do with them. So we have a lot of this knowledge, and it would be extremely helpful for us if we were trying to build a new world. Hydroponics is not actually that complicated. It's not necessarily, so hydroponics being growing plants with minimal amounts of water, usually in a vertical configuration, not always, but that's often how it's used. It allows people to grow a lot of food, or a lot of plants, but a lot of food in a small footprint of area with a minimal amount of water. This is cool. There are people that do it in their backyards, like regular people, not, PhD scientists or anything. So seeing more of that, seeing more of people doing that instead of saying, I guess we got to be cannibals again. This is a little more advanced, but things like recycling oil into diesel. This is not a thing that is easy to do, but it's a hell of a lot easier than making gasoline. You can take waste oil, and you can, in a reasonable amount of space, if you are so minded, you can refine waste oil into diesel. And there are so many diesel vehicles and so many diesel generators and so many diesel engines that could be used as diesel generators. There's just no way that humans would not try to make that stuff work. Use of hand tools. Again, nail a board straight, use a saw. I understand it's part of the aesthetic that everything is slapped together, but we're very good at using hand tools. And even people who don't, there's a lot of people that don't know how to use hand tools because our modern era does not really require us to do so. I think we would figure it out pretty quickly. Things like building with Adobe. These are things that people did thousands of years ago. Adobe was very common in the American Southwest. It's basically taking mud and some other materials and putting them together and building with it. It insulates very well. It is vulnerable to earthquakes, but you know what? They figured out you can put rebar in Adobe, and now it's resistant to earthquakes. So, people just being more resourceful about the resources that they use. Not everything needs to be kit bashed. People can build new things. They don't all have to just make amalgamations of stuff from the old world. Also, people will make art. People always make art. We love making art. Even in the face of death and destruction. So if we think back to the Black Plague running through Europe, this is at a time when in many parts of Europe, infant mortality was 50%, which is almost impossible to imagine. 50% of all people not living to the age of 12. And on top of that, you have plague, and people still made art. People made art about that. A danse macabre, Totentanz, that is a reflection of the state of the world, but it is art. People make art even when, and possibly especially when, things are dire. We find ways to adapt in the world that we live in. We have tools and space, and we make time to make art. We find ways to express ourselves. We always have, and I think we always will. And I would like to see more of that in games. By the way, this is not post-apocalyptic, but I love this aesthetic. So these are skyscrapers. I can't remember the exact lore here, but they were erected in downtown LA just before pandemic hit, and they were not occupied. And so taggers in LA scaled every single floor, and they put art all over it. And the city got real mad. But I think it's incredible. And they did it for, there's no reason. There's just the reason taggers do anything, just for bragging rights. But they scaled this thing. These are huge. And they put art all over it. I think it's great. And I do think that I would like to see faith and tradition and custom reflected more positively. Again, there are very dark sides to religion and faith, and it can be used against people very easily. I don't doubt that. I think it's worn a little thin in a lot of post-apocalyptic settings, so I would like to see a more positive reflection of it in some places. So faith and hope are necessary for life. Like, I'm not talking about religion. I'm just saying we need faith and hope to live as human beings, especially when things are bad, when the odds don't look good and we need to move forward. Faith and hope are the things that keep us going. We're not rational, right? Like, we look at things and they look really dire, and we look at the numbers on the page and we say, I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to be able to get through this. But faith and hope, even against rationality, are the things that pull us through despair. Also, religion can make sense of the world. Even if it is not a factual sense, it is a way of understanding why the world is the way that it is, and what my part in it is, and how it will be after I go. Religious stories are morally instructive. Obviously, again, this can be taken in a very bad direction, but very often it's used to tell people how to live a good life. Traditions and customs also bring order to life, celebrating holidays. Even if you don't believe in the underlying religious aspect of them, they bring a sense of cadence and rhythm to life that in their absence just feels like one miserable day after another. And belief in salvation comforts the damned. If you think, and none of us are going to make it, right? On a long timeline, we're all going to succumb, but it brings faith to the damned, right? Or it brings comfort to the damned. So if you know that you're not going to make it, the belief that something is going to persist past you is comforting to people. This is I think it's a great quote from a Paul Schrader film, First Reformed. Wisdom is holding two contradictory ideas in our head simultaneously, hope and despair. A life without despair is a life without hope. Holding these two ideas in our head is life itself. This is something that we all live with in our personal lives, but especially when we're looking down the barrel of great catastrophe. I would like to see more representations of humanity as its own savior. Obviously, we have screwed up a lot in this world. We are continuing to screw up a lot, but I don't think that technology is going to save us. Material realities of the world can't be ignored. Like, we live in the world that we have made. It has certain limitations to it. It is the way that it is. We've made some of those things the way that it is. But we have agency. We have agency today. We have agency tomorrow. If the world ends and we're still in it, we still have agency. We choose how we organize, how we acquire and use resources, how we make and enforce customs and laws in the societies where we live, and how we treat each other in general. Like, these are all things that we do individually and collectively. And often in games, especially post-apocalyptic games, the focus is less on that and more on, we have to get a foozle and a MacGuffin to save the world. Anyone remember the ozone crisis? So this is, if you're younger, you might not remember it. We kind of stopped talking about it, which is sad. So in the 1970s and the 1980s, scientists were noticing a depletion. How am I doing on time? Oh, I'm doing okay. They noticed a depletion in ozone over Antarctica. And the ozone layer is part of the atmosphere that helps block us from certain wavelengths of light. And because it was being depleted, it was causing greenhouse gas emissions and all these other things that were very bad. Or rather, it gets complicated. It's bad. So I believe it's chlorofluorocarbons were identified as the cause. The scientists said, like, hey, we're using this stuff in hairspray and a lot of other aerosols, and we're shooting it into the air. Like millions of people around the world are doing this every day. And that's actually what is making this happen. And then something crazy happened called the Montreal Protocol. So, a story that you maybe have heard before in a different form, in a different place. All the governments in the world got together and they said, we really should do something about this. And at the Montreal Protocol, they said, we should stop using CFCs because they're destroying the ozone layer, and we should make manufacturers stop doing that. We actually did that, which is crazy to think about. Instead of just nodding our heads and walking away, we actually did that. So we actually said, yeah, let's do that. And we said, everybody stop doing that. Like, you can't do it anymore. And we pretty much got rid of CFCs. We found other ways to make hairspray. It was okay. We lived. And we reversed it. Like, it's not completely done, but it's projected that by 2065, it'll be back to pre-1980 levels. Like, we did it. We all got together and we said, let's stop messing up everything. We're not doing it for climate change, but what if we did? Not just what if we did today, but what if we did tomorrow? Or what if the world, because this is a sliding scale, right? The world is going to get bad, sorry, and then we're probably going to live in it. So we need to think about how would we live beyond that. Games, and games especially about climate collapse, are a place to say, well, okay, well, what if we change now? Like, we didn't change yesterday, we didn't change 20 years ago, but what if we change now? How can we live now in this world? And ultimately, this comes back to the thing that I love about making games, especially post-apocalyptic games, are these choices and consequences. Most games are entertainment first, but they can ask us questions about our behavior when we make choices within the games. When we get asked these questions, how do you want to move forward? How do you want to live? Do you want to let this community live or die? Do you want to spare this person or make them suffer? When we do that, we are answering questions about our own values, and that reflects back to us. We can take these thoughts back to our own lives and our own world, because while these worlds are not our world, we can easily see them from here. Thank you.